Get off my aircraft, now!
Captain Richard Cross's voice cut through the bustling gate area like a knife through silence. His blue eyes blazed with authority as he stood in the doorway of the Boeing 787, blocking the path of the woman in front of him. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't being discreet. Every passenger within 50 feet could hear the venom in his voice, the absolute certainty that he was right and she was wrong.
We need to ensure
The woman he was addressing stood there calmly, wearing faded jeans and an MIT sweatshirt, holding a first-class boarding pass that apparently meant nothing to the man with 4 gold stripes on his shoulders. What Captain Cross didn't know was that in exactly 18 minutes, the woman he was trying to humiliate would fire him in front of 300 passengers and destroy his career with a single phone call. What he didn't know was that the airline he thought he controlled actually belonged to her. But before we dive into this incredible story of power, hidden identity, and ultimate justice, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe that respect should never depend on the designer label on your clothes or the color of your skin, smash that subscribe button right now. This story is about to show you what happens when arrogance meets absolute authority. Now let me take you back to where this all began at 6:47 a.m. on a humid Tuesday morning in Miami International Airport, where a woman with a $4.8 billion secret was about to learn exactly what kind of company she had just bought. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, mixing with the chaos of delayed flights, crying children, and the endless stream of gate announcements that nobody really listens to. For most travelers, this was just another stressful morning. For Regina Thorne, it was about to become the most expensive education of her life. She had no idea that the man now pointing his finger at her chest and telling her to find another airline was about to teach her everything she needed to know about the culture of Skybridge Airlines. She had no idea that his next words would give her all the justification she needed to clean house from the top down. People like you, Captain Cross continued, his voice dripping with disgust, think you can just walk onto my plane and demand service. This is first class, not charity class. Security Regina Thorne smiled. Not the fake smile of someone trying to de-escalate a situation. The real smile of someone who had just realized that the $4.8 billion she'd spent 3 days ago to buy this airline was about to be the best investment she'd ever made. Because sometimes when you're trying to fix a broken company, the problems identify themselves. 18 hours earlier, Regina Thorne had been sitting in a leather chair on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper signing documents that would make her the majority owner of Skybridge Airlines. The acquisition had taken 8 months of negotiations, due diligence reports thick enough to stop a bullet, and enough legal fees to fund a small country's education budget. But Regina didn't buy companies to own them. She bought them to fix them. At 38, Regina had already built and sold 2 companies, both for valuations that made financial journalists scramble for new superlatives. Her first venture, a logistics software company she'd started in her MIT dorm room, had sold to Amazon for $400 million when she was 26. Her second, a machine learning platform for healthcare diagnostics, had gone to Google for $2.2 billion just 18 months ago. She could have retired to a private island somewhere, collecting art and writing checks to charity galas. Instead, she spent her days identifying broken companies and turning them into industry leaders. Not for the money, she had more of that than she could spend in 3 lifetimes, but for the challenge of proving that businesses could be both profitable and principled. Skybridge Airlines had caught her attention because it was dying. Customer satisfaction scores that would embarrass a bus company. Employee turnover rates that suggested people would rather work anywhere else. Financial losses that made investors wonder if air travel was becoming obsolete. But Regina saw potential where others saw problems. She saw an industry that moved 40 million people a year, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and touched every corner of the global economy. If she could transform Skybridge, she wouldn't just be saving a company. She'd be proving that respect, dignity, and fairness weren't luxuries that businesses couldn't afford. They were necessities that businesses couldn't survive without. The decision to go undercover hadn't been part of the original plan. That idea had crystallized 3 months ago when Regina was reviewing customer complaint files and noticed a pattern. The complaints weren't just about delayed flights or lost luggage. They were about treatment, about being made to feel unwelcome, unwanted, unworthy of basic courtesy. Complaints from Maria Gonzalez, who was asked 3 times to prove she could afford her ticket. From James Washington, who was randomly selected for additional security screening on 4 consecutive flights. From Sarah Kim, who was told the first-class bathroom was out of order while watching white passengers use it freely. Each complaint had been filed. Each complaint had been investigated. Each complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding or miscommunication. The pattern was clear even if the company refused to see it. Regina needed to see the company through the eyes of the customers who were being failed. She needed to understand not just what was happening, but how it felt to be on the receiving end of that treatment. Numbers on a spreadsheet could tell her what was broken. Only experience could tell her how to fix it. So she had booked herself on Flight 847 to London under her maiden name, Regina Mills. She'd paid for the first-class ticket with her personal credit card, all $6,000 of it, and packed a single bag with the kind of clothes she'd worn in graduate school. Comfortable jeans, worn sneakers, and an MIT sweatshirt that had survived 2 decades and 3 company launches. To anyone looking, she would appear to be exactly what Captain Cross assumed she was, a young woman who had somehow gotten hold of a ticket she couldn't afford, probably trying to scam her way into luxury accommodations she didn't deserve. The irony wasn't lost on Regina. She had spent her entire career fighting assumptions about what a tech CEO should look like, what a successful entrepreneur should sound like, what a billionaire should wear to a board meeting. She had learned that the people who judge you by your appearance are usually the same people who underestimate your ability. Captain Cross was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Regina's motivation went deeper than business strategy or customer experience metrics. It went back to a memory from 15 years ago when her father had walked into a Baltimore emergency room complaining of chest pain and was told to wait in line like everyone else because he was wearing work clothes and didn't look like someone having a heart attack. He had waited for 3 hours. By the time someone took him seriously enough to run an EKG, the damage was irreversible. He died 6 days later, not because his heart attack was untreatable, but because the assumption that a black man in work clothes was probably seeking drugs had delayed his care until it was too late. Regina had built her fortune, but she had never stopped fighting the assumptions that had killed her father. Every company she fixed, every business she transformed was her way of proving that dignity wasn't a privilege to be earned, it was a right to be protected. As she stood in that gate area, watching Captain Cross demand that security remove her from his sight, Regina wasn't just seeing poor customer service. She was seeing the same deadly assumptions that had cost her father his life, playing out in an airport instead of an emergency room. The difference was that this time she had the power to do something about it. Miami International Airport at 6:47 a.m. was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Hurricane season was in full swing, and the ripple effects of weather delays from 3 time zones away were crashing into the morning departure schedule like dominoes falling in slow motion. The air conditioning struggled against the Florida humidity that seeped through every opening, creating an atmosphere that was part icebox, part greenhouse, and entirely uncomfortable. Terminal B was packed beyond capacity with passengers who should have been airborne hours ago, camping out on every available surface with the resigned patience of people who had given up fighting circumstances beyond their control. The smell of overpriced coffee mixed with cleaning chemicals and stress sweat, creating an aromatic assault that made everyone slightly more irritable than they needed to be. Gate B7 home to Skybridge. Flight 847, bound for London Heathrow, was the epicenter of this particular storm. The departure board had been updated 6 times since midnight, with the estimated departure time creeping later with each revision. What had started as a 7:15 a.m. departure was now optimistically scheduled for 8:45 a.m., though anyone who had been watching the pattern knew that even that was probably wishful thinking. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner sat at the gate like a patient giant, gleaming white fuselage reflecting the morning sun that streamed through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a beautiful aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic in under 8 hours and carrying 330 passengers in relative comfort. But beauty meant nothing if the people responsible for operating it treated their customers like problems to be solved rather than people to be served. Skybridge Airlines was bleeding money faster than a severed artery, and everyone from the executives in Miami headquarters to the baggage handlers on the ground knew it. The company had been struggling for 3 years, ever since a series of poor strategic decisions had left them competing with budget carriers on price while trying to maintain legacy carrier costs. Employee morale had been steadily declining as management responded to financial pressure by cutting staff, reducing training, and implementing policies that prioritized operational efficiency over customer satisfaction. Flight attendants were handling larger passenger loads with fewer crew members. Gate agents were processing more passengers with less time per transaction. Pilots were flying longer routes with shorter rest periods. The result was a culture where everyone was stressed, overworked, and looking for someone else to blame for the problems they couldn't control. Passengers became adversaries rather than customers. Every request was viewed as a potential complication. Every complaint was treated as a personal attack. Into this environment walked Regina Thorne, carrying a leather messenger bag that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, but looked like something she'd bought at a thrift store. Her jeans were designer denim that fit perfectly because they'd been tailored, but they looked like something she'd pulled from a laundry basket. Her MIT sweatshirt was authentic. She'd earned that degree summa cum laude, but it was 15 years old and showed every month of its age. She looked, in other words, exactly like someone who belonged in coach, but had somehow ended up with a first-class ticket she probably couldn't afford. The gate area buzzed with the particular energy of people who had been waiting too long for something they needed to happen soon. Business travelers pecked at laptops with the desperate intensity of people trying to salvage productivity from a lost morning. Families with young children had created small camps in the corners surrounded by diaper bags, stuffed animals, and the remnants of breakfast from 3 different airport restaurants. Near the customer service desk, a line of increasingly agitated passengers waited to rebooking flights, upgrade seats, or simply demand answers that the staff didn't have. The gate agents moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had stopped caring about individual customer problems hours ago, their smiles growing more forced with each interaction. The boarding area itself was divided into clearly marked zones with different sections for different classes of passengers. First class and elite frequent flyers had their own dedicated space near the gate door, separated from the general boarding area by subtle but unmistakable barriers that communicated who belonged where. It was into this divided space that Regina walked, her boarding pass clearly marking her as a Zone 1 passenger, but her appearance suggesting she belonged somewhere else entirely. She found an empty seat near the first-class boarding area and settled in to wait, watching the interactions between staff and passengers with the analytical eye of someone who knew she'd soon be responsible for changing them. She pulled out her phone and opened a note-taking app, beginning to document everything she observed. The way the gate agents spoke differently to passengers based on their appearance. The way the flight crew greeted first-class passengers versus everyone else. The way assumptions shaped every interaction, usually without anyone involved even realizing it was happening. What Regina was witnessing wasn't unique to Skybridge Airlines, or even to the aviation industry. It was the everyday operation of unconscious bias, the way people make instant judgments based on clothing, skin color, age, gender, and 1,000 other visual cues that have nothing to do with who someone actually is or what they deserve. But in 30 minutes, when Captain Richard Cross decided that her appearance was enough reason to deny her boarding, Regina would get a personal demonstration of how that bias worked and exactly what it cost the people on the receiving end. She had bought this airline to fix it. She was about to discover just how much fixing it would need. Maria Santos had been working the Skybridge Airlines gate desk for 6 years, long enough to know which passengers would be problems before they opened their mouths. At 28, she was a single mother raising 2 kids on a salary that barely covered rent in Miami, and she had learned to read people quickly and efficiently because her performance metrics depended on processing passengers fast and keeping complaint numbers low. Maria was good at her job most of the time. She spoke 3 languages fluently, knew the computer system inside and out, and could rebook a complex itinerary faster than most people could order coffee. But she was also tired. Bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from working rotating shifts, dealing with angry customers, and wondering how you're going to pay for your daughter's school supplies on what airlines consider a living wage. The pressure from management had been relentless lately. Every week brought new directives about efficiency, productivity, and customer satisfaction scores. Gate agents were tracked on how many passengers they processed per hour, how long their average transaction took, and how many passengers they moved through the line without complications. The message was clear. Move people, quickly avoid problems, and don't create situations that generate complaints or delays. What management didn't acknowledge was that this pressure created its own problems. When you're incentivized to make quick decisions based on limited information, you start relying on shortcuts. And those shortcuts often came down to assumptions about who would be easy to deal with and who would be difficult. Maria had learned to spot the passengers who might cause problems. People who looked confused by the process, people who seemed agitated, or demanding people whose tickets didn't match their appearance. It wasn't conscious bias. She would have been horrified at the suggestion that she treated people differently based on race or income. She thought of it as customer service intuition, the ability to anticipate issues before they developed. But intuition shaped by pressure often looked a lot like discrimination. 30 feet away, Jake Williams was performing the pre-flight safety check in the first-class cabin of Flight 847. At 35, Jake had been a flight attendant for 12 years, long enough to love the job and hate the industry. He had started flying because he wanted to see the world and help people, and on good days he still felt that sense of purpose. Jake was originally from small-town Ohio, where his parents still couldn't quite understand why their son wanted to serve drinks for a living instead of getting a real job. What they didn't understand was that Jake saw his role as something closer to a combination social worker, security guard, and hospitality professional. On any given flight, he might help an elderly passenger reach an overhead bin, calm a nervous first-time flyer, or diffuse a conflict between passengers who had been drinking too much. But the job had changed over the years, and not for the better. Staffing cuts meant fewer flight attendants handling more passengers. Schedule pressure meant less time for the personal touches that made flying pleasant. And company culture increasingly emphasized following procedures over using judgment, covering liability over providing service. Jake had witnessed enough discrimination over the years to recognize it when he saw it. But he had also learned that speaking up often did more damage to his career than good for the passengers involved. Flight attendants who caused disruptions by challenging captains' decisions or questioning gate procedures found themselves assigned to less desirable routes, passed over for promotions, or subjected to additional scrutiny that could end their careers. So Jake had developed a strategy of quiet resistance, doing what he could to help passengers within the confines of the rules, offering extra kindness to people who were clearly being treated unfairly, and documenting incidents that he hoped someone with more power would eventually address. He had no idea that someone with ultimate power was about to board his flight. In the cockpit, First Officer David Kim was running through the pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that small details could mean the difference between life and death. At 29, David was the newest member of the Skybridge pilot staff, having been hired just 8 months ago after completing his training with a regional carrier. David had grown up in Los Angeles, the son of Korean immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they had never had. His father owned a dry cleaning business, and his mother worked nights as a hospital cleaner, and they had both worked extra shifts for years to pay for David's flight training because they believed education and professional achievement were the pathways to respect and security in America. What David's parents hadn't prepared him for was the discovery that professional achievement didn't automatically translate to professional respect. Despite having excellent training records and outstanding performance reviews, David often found himself having to prove his competence in ways that his white colleagues didn't. Passengers sometimes questioned whether he was qualified to be in the cockpit. Ground crew occasionally asked for additional verification of his authority, and senior pilots like Captain Cross often treated him more like a student than a fully certified professional. David believed in following procedures, respecting chain of command, and maintaining the safety and professionalism that made aviation the safest form of travel. But he also believed in treating people with dignity and fairness, values that sometimes created internal conflict when he witnessed behavior that violated those principles. He had learned to pick his battles carefully. Challenge authority too often and you'd find yourself looking for a new job. Stay silent too often and you'd find yourself complicit in actions you knew were wrong. It was a balance that required constant recalibration, and David was still learning where the lines were. Standing near the security checkpoint, Officer Tommy Rodriguez was beginning his shift with the weary resignation of someone who had seen it all and helped very little of it. At 45, Tommy had been working airport security for 8 years, ever since a back injury had ended his career in construction and forced him to find work that didn't require lifting anything heavier than a radio. Tommy had grown up in Miami's Little Havana, where he had learned early that respect was something you had to earn every day and defend every time someone tested you. But airport security work had taught him that respect was complicated when you were dealing with stressed travelers, tight schedules, and regulations that often seemed designed more to create the appearance of safety than actual security. The job required making quick decisions about people based on limited information, and Tommy had learned to rely on his instincts about who might be a problem. But he had also learned that those instincts were shaped by training experience and unconscious assumptions that didn't always lead to fair outcomes. Tommy prided himself on treating everyone with professionalism and courtesy, but he also knew that professionalism could look different depending on the situation. A businessman complaining about delays got patient explanations. A young person questioning procedures got firm reminders about authority. A passenger who seemed out of place got additional scrutiny just to be safe. In 15 minutes, these 4 people, Maria, Jake, David, and Tommy, would all be forced to choose between following orders and following their conscience. Their decisions would determine not just the outcome of Regina Thorne's day, but the future of their own careers and the direction of the company they worked for. None of them knew that the woman in the MIT sweatshirt was about to give them the most important test of their professional lives. At 7:15 a.m., exactly when Flight 847 was supposed to be pushing back from the gate, Regina Thorne watched Maria Santos deal with her 47th passenger of the morning shift. The woman in question was elderly, confused about her boarding zone and speaking English with a thick Eastern European accent that made every exchange take twice as long as it should have. "Ma'am, you're Zone 4. Maria said for the 3rd time, her customer service smile growing more strained with each repetition. "Zone 4 boards after Zone 3. Please step aside and wait for your zone to be called." The elderly woman looked around helplessly, clearly not understanding the system, but equally clearly not wanting to cause problems. She clutched her boarding pass like a lifeline and moved aside with the defeated posture of someone who had learned that airports were places where she didn't belong. Regina made a mental note. System assumes passengers understand airline procedures without adequate explanation. Staff trained for efficiency over comprehension. 2 passengers later, Maria's demeanor shifted completely. A man in an expensive suit approached the desk with the confident stride of someone who expected immediate attention. Before he even reached the counter, Maria's posture straightened, and her smile became genuine. "Mr. Patterson." Maria's voice carried warmth that hadn't been there moments before. "Welcome back. How was the conference in Vegas?" Patterson handed over his boarding pass without looking at Maria. His attention focused on his phone. "Fine. I need to be in 3A today, not 3B. Make it happen. Of course, let me see what I can do." Maria's fingers flew over her keyboard with an efficiency that suggested this type of request was routine. "Perfect. I've got you moved to 3A. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Just make sure the flight leaves on time. I have a meeting in London that can't be moved." Patterson took his boarding pass and walked away without saying thank you. Regina noted the contrast. Difficult request from frequent flyer immediate accommodation. Confusion from elderly passenger impatience and dismissal. As Regina continued observing, a pattern became clear. Passengers who looked like they belonged in first-class expensive clothes, confident demeanor, business accessories received patient-accommodating service. Passengers who looked uncertain, underdressed, or unfamiliar with airline procedures received efficient but impersonal processing that emphasized getting them through the line quickly, rather than ensuring they understood what was happening. At 7:30 a.m., Captain Richard Cross emerged from the jet bridge with the theatrical presence of someone who knew he was being watched. At 52, Cross had the silver-haired gravitas of a pilot from central casting, all square jaw and commanding posture. His uniform was immaculate, with 4 gold stripes polished to a mirror shine and wings that caught the terminal lighting perfectly. Cross made his way to the gate desk with the casual authority of someone who owned whatever space he occupied. The effect on the staff was immediate and obvious. Maria straightened her shoulders and smoothed her hair. The other gate agents busied themselves with tasks that suddenly seemed urgent. Even passengers in the seating area looked up, recognizing the presence of someone important. Maria Cross said, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone addressing a valued subordinate. "How are we looking this morning?" "Good morning, Captain Cross. We're showing full load 330 passengers. Weather delay has us about 40 minutes behind schedule, but we should be able to make up time in the air." Cross nodded approvingly, then let his gaze sweep across the waiting area. Regina watched him take inventory of the passengers, his eyes lingering on certain individuals for longer than others. When his gaze reached her, she felt the weight of assessment, the calculation of whether she belonged in the space she occupied. "First class full today?" Cross asked, still looking at Regina. "Yes, sir. Full first-class business is at 89%, economy is oversold by 12. Cross's expression suggested this was exactly what he wanted to hear. A full first-class cabin meant high-value passengers, people who paid premium prices and expected premium treatment. It meant the kind of flight that justified his salary and reinforced his sense of professional importance. "Any issues I should know about?" The question seemed casual, but Regina could hear the underlying meaning. "Are there any passengers who might cause problems for my smooth operation?" "Nothing unusual, Captain. Standard Tuesday morning crowd." Cross nodded again and began walking toward the boarding area, but not before making eye contact with Regina one more time. This time his expression was unmistakably skeptical, the look of someone who had spotted something that didn't quite fit. As Cross disappeared down the jet bridge to complete his pre-flight preparations, Regina realized she had been identified as a potential problem. She wasn't sure if it was because of her age, her clothing, her race, or simply the fact that she didn't fit Cross's mental image of what a first-class passenger should look like. But she was certain that she was now on his radar in a way that wouldn't work in her favor. At 7:45 a.m. boarding finally began. Maria stepped to the gate microphone with the weary efficiency of someone who had made this announcement thousands of times. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin boarding Flight 847 to London Heathrow. We'll start with Zone 1, which includes our first class and business class passengers along with our Diamond and Platinum frequent flyers. If you're not in Zone 1, please remain seated until your zone is called." The first-class passengers rose with the synchronized movement of people who knew exactly how this process worked. Regina watched them form a line: businessman in expensive suits, an elderly couple whose clothes screamed old money, a woman whose jewelry caught the light with every movement, and a tech executive whose casual clothes still managed to communicate wealth and status. Regina joined the line, her boarding pass clearly marking her as Zone 1 Seat 2A First Class. But even as she stood among the other premium passengers, she felt the weight of not belonging. It wasn't just her clothes, though her jeans and sweatshirt certainly stood out among the business attire around her. It was something more subtle, the way the other passengers unconsciously created space around her, the way their conversations paused when she moved within earshot. As the line moved forward, Regina could see Captain Cross through the windows of the jet bridge. He was greeting passengers as they boarded, shaking hands with the men, offering charming smiles to the women, creating the kind of personal connection that made people feel special about their travel experience. She could also see him watching the gate area through those same windows, his attention focused specifically on the Zone 1 boarding line. When his gaze settled on her, Regina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the airport air conditioning. Captain Cross had made a decision about her before she had even spoken to him. In 5 minutes, when she reached the aircraft door, she was going to discover exactly what that decision meant for her travel plans. She was also going to discover that sometimes the biggest problems identify themselves. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a tunnel toward Judgment Day. Regina walked slowly, her leather bag comfortable on her shoulder, listening to the excited chatter of the passengers around her. The businessman behind her was talking loudly into his phone about quarterly projections. The elderly couple ahead was discussing their upcoming cruise through the Mediterranean. Everyone seemed to belong exactly where they were, except Regina. Through the jet bridge windows, she could see Captain Cross positioned at the aircraft door like a sentinel. He was greeting each first-class passenger with personalized attention, clearly enjoying his role as the face of premium service. Regina watched him shake hands firmly with the men, offer gallant assistance to the women, and create moments of connection that would be remembered long after the flight landed. "Mr. Peterson, good to see you again," Cross said to a silver-haired businessman. "How's the golf game?" "Terrible as always, Richard, but at least it's consistent." Peterson laughed as Cross clapped him on the shoulder with practiced familiarity. "Mrs. Chen, welcome aboard. Did your daughter enjoy graduation?" Cross's tone with the elegant Asian woman was warm but respectful. The perfect balance of personal attention and professional courtesy. "Oh, Captain Cross, thank you for asking. She loved Harvard, just as you predicted she would." Mrs. Chen beamed with the satisfaction of a parent whose advice had been validated by someone she respected. Regina noted the captain's impressive memory for passenger details, his ability to make each person feel recognized and valued. Under different circumstances, she would have been impressed by the level of personal service. These were the moments that created customer loyalty, the human connections that made people choose one airline over another. But Regina also noticed something else, the subtle but unmistakable shift in Cross's demeanor as different passengers approached. With passengers who looked like him, white wealthy, established, his warmth was genuine and unguarded. With passengers who looked different, his courtesy was more formal, more distant, more calculated. When a young black businessman approached, Cross's handshake was brief and professional rather than warm. When a Latina woman in business attire reached the door, his smile was polite rather than welcoming. The differences were small, perhaps undetectable to casual observation, but they were consistent and deliberate. Regina was 3 passengers away from the aircraft door when she heard Cross's voice rise slightly in volume, intended to carry beyond his immediate conversation. "I always say first class is about more than just the seat you buy," Cross was telling an older white couple. "It's about understanding what premium service really means. Some people think they can buy their way into respect, but respect is something you earn through how you present yourself and how you treat others. The words seemed innocent enough, but Regina caught the way Cross's eyes flicked toward her as he spoke. The message was clear. He had already decided she didn't earn the respect that came with her ticket price. 2 passengers ahead, Regina could feel Cross's attention focusing on her with increasing intensity. She watched him process her appearance, her age, her race, the casual clothes that marked her as an outsider in this carefully curated space. She could see him reaching the same conclusion that gate agent Maria had reached. This woman didn't belong here. 1 passenger ahead. Cross was still greeting people with his practiced charm, but Regina could see him glancing repeatedly in her direction. His jaw was set slightly tighter, his posture a bit more rigid. He was preparing for a confrontation, gearing himself up to be the guardian of first-class exclusivity. As the elderly couple ahead of Regina passed through the door and into the aircraft, Cross turned his full attention to her. His smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the stern expression of someone who had identified a problem that needed to be solved immediately. Regina stepped forward, her boarding pass ready, her expression calm and neutral. She had dealt with challenging situations her entire career, and she knew that the key to maintaining control was never to let emotions drive behavior. Whatever was about to happen, she would handle it with the professionalism that had carried her through 2 decades of business negotiations. "Good morning," Captain Regina said politely, offering her phone with the digital boarding pass clearly displayed. Cross looked at her for a long moment before glancing at the boarding pass. When he looked back at her face, his expression had hardened into something that was no longer professional courtesy but open hostility. "I don't think so," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that passengers already seated in first class could hear every word. Regina felt a familiar sensation in her chest. Not surprise, because she had expected this moment, but disappointment that her expectations had been proven correct. In a few seconds, Captain Cross was going to validate every customer complaint she had read, every concern about company culture she had identified, every reason she had bought this airline to fix it. "I'm sorry." Regina kept her voice level and her expression neutral. "This is first class." Cross said, his volume increasing to ensure that everyone nearby could hear his authority being exercised. "This section is for paying customers who understand what premium service means." Regina could feel the attention of everyone within earshot focusing on their interaction. Conversations paused. Phones came up to record. The careful choreography of premium passenger boarding had ground to a halt as Captain Cross turned a routine verification into a public spectacle. "I believe you'll find my reservation is in order," Regina said, holding up her phone again. Cross didn't even look at the screen this time. He had made his decision based on something other than documentation, and no amount of evidence was going to change his mind. What happened next would either validate everything Regina believed about broken organizational culture or force her to reconsider her assumptions about the company she had just bought. It turned out validation was coming. "Get off my aircraft. Now!" The words hit the jet bridge like a physical force, stopping conversations and freezing passengers in mid-step. Captain Richard Cross's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question, someone whose word was law at 30,000 feet, and who saw no reason it shouldn't be law at sea level as well. Regina looked at him for a moment, processing not just what he had said, but how he had chosen to say it. Loudly, publicly, with maximum humiliation for her and maximum demonstration of power for everyone else watching. This wasn't about documentation or procedure. This was about establishing dominance. "Captain, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Regina said, her voice calm but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I have a confirmed first-class reservation seat 2A. Perhaps we could verify this through your system." Cross stepped closer, invading her personal space with the aggressive posture of someone who had decided that intimidation was the appropriate response to what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over Regina's 5 feet 6 inches, using his physical presence to reinforce his verbal aggression. "Don't tell me about my system," Cross said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've been flying for 25 years and I know exactly who belongs in first class and who doesn't. People like you think you can scam your way into premium accommodations with stolen credit cards and fake reservations." Regina felt the familiar fire that she had learned to control in boardrooms full of men who assumed she was someone's assistant. The accusation of fraud was designed to humiliate, to make her defensive, to put her in the position of having to prove her worth to someone who had already decided she had none. "People like me," Regina's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath the silk now. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Captain Cross's expression suggested he knew exactly what he meant, and didn't care who else knew it too. "People who try to game the system. People who think they can dress down and act up and still expect to be treated like paying customers. This is first class, not charity class." Behind Regina, the jet bridge had become a theater. Passengers who had already boarded were returning to the doorway to see what was happening. Passengers still waiting to board were pressing forward to get a better view. Phones were emerging from purses and pockets as people realized they were witnessing something that would definitely be worth sharing. Elena Rodriguez, the travel blogger who had been documenting her journey for her YouTube channel, was already live streaming. Her phone was positioned to capture both Regina's composed response and Cross's increasingly aggressive behavior. In the corner of her screen, she could see her viewer count climbing rapidly as people shared the stream and commented on what they were watching. "Let me see your identification," Cross demanded, holding out his hand with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Real identification, not whatever fake documents you used to get that boarding pass." Regina reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license, handing it over with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to document discrimination rather than escalate it. Cross examined the license with exaggerated scrutiny, as if he were a forensic expert capable of detecting sophisticated forgeries. "Regina Mills," he read aloud, making her maiden name sound suspicious through tone alone. "And you're telling me that Regina Mills bought a $6,000 ticket on a Tuesday morning to fly to London?" "I'm telling you that I have a confirmed reservation and valid documentation," Regina replied. "What I'm wondering is why you seem more interested in my appearance than my paperwork." Cross's face reddened slightly, the flush of someone who had been called out on behavior he preferred to keep subtle. "My job is to maintain security and ensure that only legitimate passengers board this aircraft. When someone looks like they don't belong in first class, I have an obligation to verify their credentials thoroughly. And how exactly does someone look like they belong in first class?" Regina asked, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who was building a legal case, one question at a time. "You know exactly what I mean," Cross said, his voice rising again. "First-class passengers understand dress codes. They understand appropriate behavior. They don't show up looking like they're going to a college football game and expect to be treated like royalty." From inside the aircraft, Jake Williams had emerged to see what was causing the delay. As a flight attendant with 12 years of experience, he had witnessed this type of confrontation before, always with the same pattern: a passenger who didn't fit someone's preconceived notion of what a premium traveler should look like, a staff member who decided to make assumptions rather than check facts, and a situation that escalated beyond what anyone intended. "Captain Cross," Jake said carefully, "perhaps I could help verify the passenger's reservation in the system." Cross turned on Jake with the fury of someone whose authority had been questioned by a subordinate. "Flight Attendant Williams, return to your duties immediately. I am handling this situation, and I don't require assistance from cabin crew." Jake's expression showed the internal conflict between his desire to help a passenger being treated unfairly and his knowledge that challenging a captain's authority could end his career. After a moment that felt like an hour, he stepped back into the aircraft, but Regina could see him positioning himself where he could still observe what was happening. Security Cross shouted toward the gate area. "I need airport security at gate B7 immediately. We have a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation." Regina felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the recognition that Cross had just crossed a line that would make everything that came next much easier to justify. Filing a false report with airport security was a federal offense, regardless of what he thought about her appearance or her ticket. Captain Regina said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority that made several nearby passengers look at her more carefully. "I strongly suggest you reconsider this course of action. You're about to make a mistake that will have consequences far beyond this flight." Cross smiled with the confidence of someone who believed his authority was absolute. "The only mistake here is yours thinking you could board my aircraft and demand service you haven't earned. Security will sort this out, and then you can find another airline that's more appropriate for your budget." Regina nodded slowly, reaching into her bag for her phone. "I think that's an excellent idea, Captain. Let's absolutely get this sorted out." What Captain Cross didn't realize was that Regina wasn't reaching for her phone to call a lawyer or plead with customer service. She was reaching for her phone to call the person who, as of 72 hours ago, owned his employer, herself. Airport security arrived with the brisk efficiency of people who had responded to this type of call hundreds of times before. Officer Tommy Rodriguez led the team, his radio crackling with updates from other incidents around the terminal. Behind him walked Officer Sarah Chen and Officer Mike Thompson, both carrying the weary professionalism of people who knew that most security situations were actually customer service problems that had been allowed to escalate beyond reason. Tommy approached the scene with the calm assessment of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. He saw Captain Cross still radiating authority in his pristine uniform. He saw Regina standing calmly with her hands visible and her documentation ready. He saw the crowd of passengers with phones out recording everything, and he saw the tension that suggested this was going to be more complicated than a simple boarding pass verification. "Good morning, Captain Cross," Tommy said, his voice professionally neutral. "What seems to be the issue here?" Cross straightened to his full height, clearly relishing the opportunity to explain his actions to someone who would understand the importance of security and authority. "Officer Rodriguez. This individual is attempting to board my aircraft with what I believe to be fraudulent documentation. She claims to have a first-class ticket, but her appearance and behavior suggest otherwise." Tommy's expression didn't change, but Regina caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he had heard this type of explanation before and didn't particularly like it. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass and identification?" Regina handed over her phone and driver's license without comment. Tommy examined both carefully, noting that the boarding pass was clearly legitimate and the identification matched the name on the reservation. He pulled out his radio and called the gate desk to verify the booking. "Gate B7, this is security. Can you verify a reservation for Mills Regina on Flight 847 showing Seat 2A, Zone 1 boarding?" Maria Santos's voice crackled back over the radio. "Confirmed. Mills Regina, Seat 2A, first class, paid in full, no issues noted in the system." Tommy looked back at Captain Cross with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that this call was based on something other than legitimate security concerns. "Captain, the reservation appears to be valid. Is there something specific about the documentation that concerns you?" Cross's jaw tightened as he realized that simple verification wasn't going to support his position. "Officer Rodriguez, my responsibility is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. When someone boards an aircraft looking inappropriate for their stated accommodations, it raises questions about their intentions." Inappropriate how Tommy asked, his voice still neutral but with an edge that suggested he wanted a very specific answer. "Look at her," Cross said, gesturing toward Regina as if her appearance was self-evidently problematic. First-class passengers understand proper attire. They understand the standards that come with premium service. This individual is dressed like she's going to a basketball game, not flying internationally in a premium cabin. Regina had remained silent through this exchange, But now she spoke for the first time since security had arrived. "Officer Rodriguez, am I correct in understanding that Captain Cross called security because he objects to my clothing?" Tommy looked from Regina to Cross and back again, clearly recognizing the legal implications of what he was hearing. "Ma'am, there are no dress codes for passengers on commercial flights, regardless of the class of service they've purchased." "I understand that, officer. I'm wondering if Captain Cross understands that." Cross stepped forward aggressively, his voice rising. "Don't lecture me about airline regulations. I've been flying for 25 years and I know exactly what kind of passengers belong in first class. This woman is obviously trying to scam her way into accommodations she can't afford." Based on what evidence, Regina asked, her voice calm but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the jet bridge. "Based on common sense," Cross snapped. "Based on experience with people who try to game the system. Based on knowing the difference between legitimate passengers and opportunists." Tommy's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something harder. He had seen this pattern before: staff members who let personal prejudices override actual security concerns, who used their authority to make decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. Captain Cross, Tommy said carefully, "Are you telling me that you believe this passenger's documentation is fraudulent based solely on her appearance?" "I'm telling you that my judgment is based on 25 years of professional experience," Cross replied, his voice carrying the defensive edge of someone who knew his position was indefensible but was too committed to change course. Behind them, Elena Rodriguez continued live-streaming her viewer count, now approaching 50,000, as people shared the stream across social media platforms. The comments were coming in faster than she could read them, but the overwhelming sentiment was clear. Viewers were watching something that felt fundamentally wrong. "Oh my God, this is insane," Elena whispered to her camera while keeping the phone positioned to capture the confrontation. "This pilot is literally calling security because he doesn't like how a passenger is dressed. This is 2024, people. This is actually happening." From inside the aircraft, Jake Williams appeared again, this time carrying a clipboard and moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided that documentation was going to be his contribution to this situation. "Captain Cross," Jake said, approaching carefully, "I've checked the passenger manifest and Ms. Mills's reservation is confirmed and fully paid. There are no flags or issues noted in her booking." Cross turned on Jake with fury that had been building since his authority was first questioned. "Flight Attendant Williams, I gave you a direct order to return to your duties. Your interference in this security matter is insubordination and will be noted in your personnel file." Jake's expression showed the weight of someone making a career-defining decision in real time. After 12 years of flying, he knew exactly what challenging a captain could cost him. He also knew exactly what staying silent would cost his conscience. "Captain, with respect, ensuring passenger safety and proper treatment is part of my duties," Jake said, his voice steady despite the obvious risk he was taking. "And I believe this passenger has been treated improperly." The jet bridge had now become a theater with an audience of nearly 100 people. Passengers from the gate area had moved closer to see what was happening. Passengers already seated on the aircraft had come back to the doorway. Flight attendants from other crews had paused in their preparations to watch the confrontation. Regina looked around at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some curious, some recording for social media, and made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Carla. It's Regina. I need you to patch me through to the Skybridge Airlines Operations Center immediately." "No, I'm not in the office. I'm standing on one of our jet bridges at Miami International, and I need to speak with whoever is in charge of our flight operations right now." Cross looked puzzled by this development, but not concerned. Passengers called customer service all the time. Angry customers called executives. None of that changed the fact that he was the captain of this aircraft, and his authority was absolute within its boundaries. "Operations Center. This is Regina Thorne." Yes, that Regina Thorne. I'm calling from Gate B7 at Miami International regarding Flight 847 to London. No, there's no safety issue with the aircraft. The issue is with your captain. Cross's expression shifted from puzzlement to concern as he registered the confidence in Regina's voice and the specificity of her language. Passengers didn't typically know the names of airline executives. They didn't typically have direct phone numbers to operations centers. I need you to pull up the personnel file for Captain Richard Cross immediately. Regina continued, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. I want a complete record of passenger complaints, disciplinary actions, and performance reviews for the past 3 years. Tommy Rodriguez had stepped closer, realizing that this situation was evolving beyond a simple boarding dispute into something that would require very careful documentation. Officer Chen had her own phone out, recording the interaction from a different angle to ensure that any official reports would be supported by video evidence. Yes, I'll hold, Regina said into her phone, then looked directly at Captain Cross. Captain, I strongly recommend that you reconsider your position while we wait for this information to be retrieved. Cross's face had gone pale, but his voice remained defiant. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I am the captain of this aircraft, and my authority is not subject to your phone calls or your threats. Regina nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right about one thing, Captain. Your authority is not subject to my threats. Your employment, however, is subject to my decisions. The jet bridge fell into complete silence as the implications of that statement settled over everyone present. Cross stared at Regina as if seeing her for the first time, his mind racing to process what she might be suggesting. Operations. Yes, I'm here, Regina said into her phone. Read me those complaint numbers. 23 formal complaints in 36 months, all involving passengers of color. All complaints dismissed as misunderstandings or miscommunications. I see. She ended the call and looked back at Cross, whose expression now showed the first hint of uncertainty. Captain Cross, my name is Regina Thorne. As of midnight Sunday, I am the majority owner and chief executive officer of Skybridge Airlines. You work for me, and in about 30 seconds I'm going to decide whether you still work for me tomorrow. The silence that followed Regina's revelation lasted exactly 4 seconds, before Captain Cross's face went from pale to red to a shade of white that suggested his cardiovascular system was struggling to process what he had just heard. That's impossible. Cross said, his voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. The CEO of Skybridge Airlines is Jonathan Mitchell. Has been for 3 years. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but... Was Jonathan Mitchell? Regina interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The board voted unanimously to accept my acquisition offer Sunday night. The press release goes out tomorrow morning, but the sale closed at midnight Monday. Which makes you my employee, Captain Cross. And this conversation, my introduction to your management style. Cross looked around desperately as if the passengers and security officers surrounding him might somehow validate his disbelief. What he saw instead were dozens of phones recording every word, every expression, every moment of his professional world collapsing in real time. Tommy Rodriguez had stepped back slightly, realizing that he was no longer mediating a boarding dispute, but witnessing a corporate drama that was far above his pay grade. His radio crackled with updates from around the terminal, other security incidents that needed attention, but he couldn't leave this situation until he understood exactly what was happening and what if any laws were being violated. Officer Rodriguez Regina said, turning to Tommy with the professional courtesy of someone who understood the complexity of his position. I apologize for the confusion. Captain Cross called you under the belief that I was attempting to board with fraudulent documentation. As you've verified, my boarding pass and identification are completely legitimate. I would like to file a formal complaint for false reporting and request that this incident be documented in your official records. Tommy nodded, pulling out his incident report pad. In 8 years of airport security work, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. "Ma'am, I'll need to get statements from all parties involved." "Captain Cross, you called security based on suspicion of fraudulent documentation." Cross's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. She didn't look like... the appearance suggested. The appearance suggested what Tommy asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Regina watched Cross struggle with the impossible task of explaining his actions without admitting to exactly the kind of discrimination that would end his career and potentially result in federal charges. She felt no satisfaction in his discomfort, only the grim recognition that his behavior was exactly what she had expected to find. "Captain Cross called security because he objected to my clothing," Regina said, sparing Cross the need to incriminate himself further. "He stated that I didn't look like a first-class passenger and accused me of fraud based solely on my appearance." Elena Rodriguez, still live-streaming, had positioned herself to capture both Regina's composed professionalism and Cross's growing panic. Her viewer count had now surpassed 75,000, with comments flowing too fast to read. Several major news outlets had already reached out requesting permission to use her footage. "This is unreal," Elena whispered to her camera. "We're watching a CEO deal with discrimination from her own employee in real time. The pilot doesn't even know who he's messing with." From inside the aircraft, First Officer David Kim had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion and the realization that their scheduled departure time had come and gone with no movement toward actually departing. When he saw Captain Cross's expression and the circle of security officers, his professional training kicked in. "Captain Cross." David approached carefully, aware that whatever was happening had clearly escalated beyond routine passenger issues. "Is there a security concern with the aircraft?" Cross turned to David with the desperate expression of someone grasping for any source of support or authority. "First Officer Kim, this passenger is claiming to be the CEO of Skybridge Airlines. She's obviously delusional and potentially dangerous." David looked at Regina, taking in her calm demeanor, her professional bearing, and her obvious lack of any threatening behavior. Then he looked at Cross, whose agitation and defensiveness were increasingly obvious. "Ma'am," David said to Regina, "I apologize for any confusion. May I ask if there's anything I can do to resolve this situation?" Regina smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, not the calculated smile of someone playing political games, but the genuine appreciation of someone who had just witnessed professionalism in action. "First Officer Kim, thank you for your courtesy. What would resolve this situation is for Captain Cross to acknowledge that his actions were inappropriate, and for this flight to proceed with a crew that understands the difference between security protocols and personal prejudices." Cross stepped between Regina and David, his voice rising to a near shout. "First Officer Kim, you will not take orders from passengers regardless of what they claim to be. This aircraft is under my command, and I am ordering this individual removed for attempting to board with fraudulent credentials." David's expression showed the internal conflict between respecting chain of command and recognizing that his captain was making decisions based on something other than professional judgment. "Sir, if I may, security has verified that the passenger's documentation is legitimate. Perhaps we could—" "You may not," Cross snapped. "Return to your duties immediately, or you'll find yourself looking for a new position." The threat hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. David Kim had worked too hard for too long to get where he was to lose his job over a single confrontation. But he had also been raised with values that wouldn't allow him to stand silent while someone was being treated unjustly. After a moment that felt like an eternity, David made his choice. "Captain Cross, with respect. I believe you're making an error in judgment that could have serious consequences for your career and for the company." Cross's face went scarlet. "That's insubordination, First Officer Kim. You're grounded pending investigation." Regina had been watching this exchange with the analytical mind of someone who managed large organizations and understood the dynamics of authority, fear, and courage. What she was seeing confirmed every concern she had about company culture and gave her hope that change was possible. Captain Cross Regina said, her voice cutting through his anger with surgical precision. "You've now threatened the jobs of 2 employees who attempted to provide appropriate customer service. You've filed a false security report based on racial profiling. And you've created a public incident that's currently being live-streamed to over 75,000 viewers. I strongly suggest you take a moment to consider whether this is the hill you want your career to die on." Cross turned on her with the fury of someone who had been backed into a corner and could see no way out except through aggression. "You can claim to be whoever you want, but I know exactly what you are. You're a scammer who thought she could intimidate her way into accommodations she doesn't deserve. Well, it's not working." Security Tommy Rodriguez looked up from his incident report with the weary expression of someone who had hoped this situation might resolve itself peacefully. "Captain Cross, I've verified the passenger's documentation multiple times. There's no evidence of fraud or security concerns. What specifically do you want me to do? I want you to remove this individual from the premises for attempting to board with invalid credentials and for creating a disturbance that's preventing my flight from departing." Tommy looked at Regina, whose calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Cross's increasing agitation. "Ma'am, have you made any threats or engaged in any disruptive behavior?" "Officer Rodriguez, the only disruption here is Captain Cross's refusal to allow a legitimately ticketed passenger to board based on his objection to her appearance." Tommy nodded and made another note in his report. "Captain Cross, I cannot remove a passenger who has valid documentation and has not engaged in any disruptive behavior. If you continue to refuse boarding to a legitimate passenger, you could be in violation of federal anti-discrimination laws." Cross stared at Tommy as if the security officer had just spoken in a foreign language. "Are you telling me that you're going to take the word of some random passenger over a captain with 25 years of experience?" "I'm telling you that the law requires me to base my actions on evidence, not assumptions," Tommy replied. Regina pulled out her phone again and dialed another number. "Carla, it's Regina again. I need you to conference in the Skybridge Legal Department. Immediately." "No, we're still at the gate and the situation has escalated." Cross watched with growing alarm as Regina's conversation continued with the confidence of someone who had immediate access to corporate resources. "Legal. This is Regina Thorne. I'm dealing with an incident at Miami International involving one of our captains who has refused boarding to a legitimate passenger based on discriminatory profiling. Yes, I'm the passenger in question. I need immediate guidance on termination procedures for cause and federal reporting requirements for civil rights violations." The jet bridge had become completely silent except for Regina's phone conversation and the ambient noise of the airport around them. Passengers had stopped pretending to do anything other than watch the drama unfold. Flight attendants from other airlines had gathered to witness what was clearly going to become industry legend. "Understood," Regina said, ending her call. "Captain Cross, I've just been informed that Skybridge Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and that federal law requires immediate reporting of civil rights violations. You've created a liability situation that the company cannot and will not defend." Cross's expression showed the dawning recognition that his situation was far worse than he had realized. "This is insane. I was following security protocols. I was protecting the airline's reputation. You were profiling a passenger based on race and appearance," Regina said quietly. "And now you're going to face the consequences of that choice." She turned to Officer Rodriguez. "Officer, I'd like to complete my statement for your report. And then I'd like to board my flight and put this unfortunate incident behind us." Tommy nodded and prepared to continue his documentation. Behind him, Captain Cross stood frozen in the realization that the next few minutes would determine whether he still had a career in aviation. What he didn't realize was that the decision had already been made. The moment Regina ended her call with Skybridge Legal Officer Rodriguez received a radio call that would change everything about how he understood the situation unfolding in front of him. Unit 47, this is command. We need you to hold your position at Gate B7. We have corporate executives en route to your location. Tommy pressed his radio button with a growing sense that this incident was spinning beyond anything his training had prepared him for. Command. Can you clarify what corporate executives, Skybridge Airlines Senior Management ETA 5 minutes, maintain scene security and continue documentation? Cross heard the radio exchange and felt a surge of vindication. Finally, real authority was coming to sort out this mess. Corporate executives would understand the importance of supporting their captain's judgment. They would recognize that passenger complaints couldn't be allowed to undermine operational authority. They would restore order to this chaos. You hear that Cross said to Regina, his confidence returning. Corporate is coming. Real corporate. And when they get here, they'll put an end to whatever game you're playing. Regina nodded thoughtfully. I'm sure they will, Captain. What Cross didn't understand was that the corporate executives en route were Regina's own assistants dispatched from Skybridge headquarters the moment she had called for legal support. In the corporate world, when a CEO calls from the field reporting a discrimination incident, every department mobilizes immediately. Elena Rodriguez, still live streaming, had now attracted the attention of mainstream media. Her phone was buzzing constantly with interview requests and offers to purchase her footage. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across social platforms faster than any crisis management team could hope to contain. Guys, this is absolutely unreal, Elena whispered to her camera. The pilot called corporate executives to back him up, but he doesn't know that the woman he's discriminating against owns the entire airline. This is about to get so much worse for him. 5 minutes later, 3 people in business attire approached Gate B7 with the purposeful stride of executives responding to a crisis. Leading the group was Carla Martinez Regina's chief of staff, followed by David Chen, the head of legal affairs, and Sarah Williams, the newly appointed head of human resources. Cross straightened his uniform and prepared to explain the situation to people who would understand the complexities of airline operations and passenger management. What he didn't expect was for all 3 executives to walk directly to Regina and address her with the deference reserved for senior leadership. Ms. Thorne Carla said, slightly out of breath from moving quickly through the terminal, I apologize for the delay. Security cleared us through as quickly as possible once we explained the situation. Cross stared at the interaction with growing confusion. Excuse me, but I'm Captain Cross, and I'm the one who called for Captain Cross. David Chen interrupted his voice, carrying the cold precision of someone delivering legal consequences. I'm David Chen, General Counsel for Skybridge Airlines. We need to discuss your actions this morning and their implications for both your employment and the company's legal exposure. The professional courtesy in Chen's voice did nothing to mask the underlying message. Cross was in serious trouble, and this conversation was going to determine just how serious. Sarah Williams stepped forward with a tablet in her hands and an expression that suggested she had already reviewed Cross's personnel file during the drive to the airport. Captain Cross, I'm Sarah Williams, Human Resources. We need to address several immediate concerns about your conduct this morning. Cross looked around desperately, trying to understand how a simple passenger boarding issue had suddenly become a corporate crisis involving the highest levels of company leadership. I don't understand what's happening here, Cross said, his voice starting to crack under the pressure of events beyond his control. This passenger was attempting to board with questionable documentation. I was following standard security protocols. I was protecting the airline's interests. Regina spoke for the first time since the executives had arrived. Captain Cross was protecting the airline from the threat of a paying customer whose appearance he found inappropriate for first-class accommodations. Carla Martinez looked at Cross with the expression of someone calculating the damage control that would be required to contain this incident. Captain Cross, are you saying that you denied boarding to a legitimate passenger based on her appearance? I'm saying that experience has taught me to be suspicious when someone doesn't fit the profile of our typical premium passengers. Cross replied, apparently unaware that he was providing a textbook definition of discriminatory profiling. David Chen was taking notes on his phone, documenting every word for the legal record that would be required for federal reporting. Captain Cross, when you say doesn't fit the profile, what specific characteristics were you referencing? Cross's mouth opened and closed several times as he realized that any answer he gave would either be an admission of racial discrimination or a demonstration of his inability to articulate legitimate security concerns. Her clothing, Cross finally said. First-class passengers understand appropriate attire for premium service. Captain Cross. Sarah Williams said, consulting her tablet. Skybridge Airlines has no dress code for passengers in any class of service. Are you saying you created and enforced a policy that doesn't exist? The trap was closing around Cross with the methodical precision of a legal proceeding, each question designed to establish facts that would support whatever consequences were already being planned. Tommy Rodriguez had been documenting this entire exchange in his incident report, recognizing that he was witnessing the real-time destruction of someone's career and wanting to ensure that the record was complete and accurate. From inside the aircraft, Jake Williams had returned to the doorway drawn by the arrival of corporate executives and the realization that this incident had escalated far beyond anything he had witnessed in 12 years of flying. Ms. Thorne, Jake said, approaching carefully. I want to apologize for Captain Cross's behavior and for any failure on my part to intervene more effectively. This doesn't represent the values that I believe Skybridge should stand for. Regina turned to Jake with an expression of genuine appreciation. Mr. Williams, you attempted to do the right thing in a difficult situation. That takes courage, and it will be remembered. Cross stared at Jake with a mixture of betrayal and fury. Williams, you're speaking to corporate executives without going through proper channels. That's insubordination and grounds for immediate termination. Actually, Sarah Williams said, consulting her tablet again. Mr. Williams is demonstrating exactly the kind of customer service and ethical leadership that we want to see from our employees. His actions this morning will be noted positively in his personnel file. The reversal was complete and devastating. In the span of 10 minutes, Cross had gone from being the authority figure calling for backup to being the subject of an investigation by his own company's leadership team. I don't understand what's happening here, Cross said, his voice now openly desperate. This passenger was obviously trying to scam her way into first class. I was protecting the company from liability and bad publicity. How is that wrong? Regina looked at him with something that might have been pity if it weren't so clearly justified anger. Captain Cross, the bad publicity and liability you were trying to prevent? You created it. The scammer you were trying to identify. You were looking at your boss. She turned to the assembled executives. Carla will want a complete review of Captain Cross's employment history with particular attention to any patterns of discrimination or customer complaints. David, I want to understand our federal reporting obligations and potential liability exposure. Sarah, I want immediate implementation of mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees. Cross watched this corporate machinery swing into action with the growing realization that his 25-year career was ending in real-time broadcast live to an audience of hundreds of thousands of people. This is insane, Cross said, his voice rising to a shout that could be heard throughout the gate area. You can't destroy my career because I wouldn't let some random person intimidate their way into accommodations they don't deserve. Regina looked at him with the calm expression of someone who had just been provided with all the evidence she needed to justify whatever consequences were coming next. "Captain Cross," she said quietly, "your career isn't being destroyed because you wouldn't let me board. It's being destroyed because you called security on a paying customer based solely on the color of her skin and the clothes she was wearing. The difference matters even if you can't see it." The jet bridge fell silent except for the ambient noise of the airport around them. Cross looked around at the faces surrounding him, passengers recording with their phones, security officers completing their reports, corporate executives calculating consequences, and fellow employees who had chosen to stand up for what was right instead of standing with him. For the first time since this confrontation had begun, Captain Richard Cross began to understand that he had made a mistake that couldn't be undone, explained away or defended with appeals to authority and experience. He was about to discover that some mistakes have consequences that last forever. Regina Thorne had spent her entire career understanding the power of timing. In business negotiations, in product launches, in crisis management, knowing exactly when to reveal information was often more important than the information itself. As she stood in that jet bridge surrounded by passengers with phones recording every moment, she knew that the next 60 seconds would define not just Captain Cross's future, but the entire culture of the airline she had just purchased. She walked to the gate microphone that Maria Santos had abandoned when the security situation began. The act of a passenger approaching airline equipment should have prompted immediate intervention from staff, but everyone present understood that normal rules no longer applied to this situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Regina said, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area and beyond, as Elena Rodriguez's live stream broadcast her words to over 100,000 viewers worldwide. "I apologize for the delay to Flight 847. My name is Regina Thorne, and I need to address what you've just witnessed." The terminal fell silent in the way that only happens when people recognize they're about to hear something important. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Passengers rushing to other gates slowed their pace. Even the gate agents at nearby counters paused their work to listen. 3 days ago, I completed the acquisition of Skybridge Airlines. As of midnight Monday, I became the majority owner and chief executive officer of this company. This morning, I chose to fly as a regular passenger to experience firsthand the service culture that our customers encounter every day. Captain Cross stood frozen behind her, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he began to understand the full scope of his mistake. What you have witnessed this morning is Captain Richard Cross denying boarding to a legitimately ticketed passenger based solely on his objection to her appearance and his assumption that a black woman in casual clothing could not possibly belong in first class. The sharp intake of breath from the crowd was audible even over the ambient noise of the terminal. Phone cameras swiveled to capture Cross's reaction, his expression providing confirmation of every accusation Regina was making. Captain Cross called airport security claiming that I was attempting to board with fraudulent documentation. This was a false report filed not because of any evidence of wrongdoing, but because I didn't match his personal image of what a first-class passenger should look like. Elena Rodriguez was whispering rapid commentary into her phone as the viewer count climbed past 150,000. "This is absolutely incredible. The CEO is explaining exactly what happened in real time with the pilot standing right there. He looks like he's about to faint." When flight attendant Jake Williams attempted to provide appropriate customer service by verifying my legitimate reservation, Captain Cross threatened his employment. When First Officer David Kim tried to de-escalate the situation professionally, Captain Cross suspended him from duty. Both of these employees demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and customer focus that Skybridge Airlines should represent. Regina's voice remained calm and measured, but everyone listening could hear the steel underneath her words. "I have spent the last 8 months conducting due diligence on this company, reviewing customer complaints, studying employee satisfaction surveys, and analyzing the cultural problems that have led to declining performance and customer defection. What I found in those reports I experienced firsthand this morning." She gestured toward Cross, who remained motionless, as if movement might somehow make the situation worse than it already was. Captain Cross's behavior this morning represents a pattern of discrimination that has been documented in customer complaints but never adequately addressed by previous management. His personnel file shows 23 formal complaints over the past 3 years, all involving passengers of color, all dismissed as misunderstandings without proper investigation. The crowd began to murmur as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor customer service. It was evidence of ongoing discrimination that had been ignored. As CEO of Skybridge Airlines, I want to be absolutely clear about our company's values and policies going forward. Every passenger who purchases a ticket has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, age, gender appearance, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with their legitimate business with our airline. Regina turned to face Cross directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering consequences that had already been decided. "Captain Cross, your employment with Skybridge Airlines is terminated effective immediately. Your actions this morning represent gross misconduct, violation of federal anti-discrimination laws, and filing of a false police report. These termination grounds will be reported to the Federal Aviation Administration as required by law." Cross finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "You can't do this. I have union protection. I have 25 years of service. You can't destroy my career because of one misunderstanding." Regina's expression didn't change. "Captain Cross, this wasn't a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is accidentally giving someone the wrong information. What you did was deliberately discriminate against a paying customer based on racial profiling, then lie to federal authorities to justify your actions. The union contract doesn't protect employees who violate federal law." She turned back to the microphone, addressing the broader audience that included not just the passengers present, but the hundreds of thousands watching online. "To our customers, both those present today and those watching this unfold, you have my personal commitment that Skybridge Airlines will earn back your trust through actions, not just words. We will implement immediate changes to ensure that every passenger is treated with the respect they deserve. To our employees, if you witness discrimination, report it. If you experience pressure to ignore bias or suppress complaints, escalate it directly to my office. And if you choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, you will be supported and protected." The applause began slowly, with a few passengers clapping tentatively, then building as more people joined in. Within seconds, the entire gate area was erupting in applause that could be heard throughout the terminal. Elena Rodriguez was practically shouting into her phone to be heard over the noise. She just fired the pilot live on camera. She fired him in front of everyone for discriminating against her. "This is the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Tommy Rodriguez approached Regina as the applause died down, his incident report complete, but his understanding of the situation forever changed. "Ms. Thorne, I've completed my documentation of the incident. Captain Cross filed a false report based on racial profiling, and I'll be forwarding this to federal authorities as required. I want to personally apologize for any role airport security played in allowing this situation to escalate." Regina shook his hand with genuine warmth. "Officer Rodriguez, you handled this situation professionally and fairly. You verified the facts, you followed the law, and you documented everything properly. That's exactly what we needed." She turned to the corporate executives who had remained silent during her public statement, watching their new CEO handle a crisis with the kind of leadership they had hoped for when the board approved her acquisition. "Carla, please coordinate with media relations. We'll need a full press statement within the hour. David, start the federal reporting process immediately. Sarah, I want a complete review of our anti-discrimination policies and training programs on my desk by end of business today." As the executives dispersed to handle their assigned tasks, Regina finally turned her attention to the flight that had been delayed by the entire incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, Flight 847 will now begin boarding with First Officer Kim in command. Our crew will provide you with the excellent service that you deserve and that Skybridge Airlines is committed to delivering. As passengers began moving toward the aircraft, Regina reflected on the morning that had changed everything. She had bought this airline to fix its problems. She had discovered that some problems fix themselves once you provide consequences for behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place. Captain Richard Cross remained standing in the jet bridge surrounded by corporate security who would escort him from the premises. His 25-year career was over-ended not by market forces or technological change, but by his own choices and his inability to see past the prejudices that had shaped his decisions. Regina Thorne, meanwhile, was about to board the flight she had paid for to sit in the seat she had reserved and to experience the service that every passenger deserved. The difference was that now she owned the airline and she was going to make sure that service was exactly what they received. The immediate aftermath of Regina's public revelation moved with the speed of a crisis that had become too big to contain or control. Within minutes, Elena Rodriguez's live stream had been shared across every major social media platform, generating trending hashtags that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. Skybridge justice spread faster than airline executives could track it. CEO Undercover became a rallying cry for customers who had experienced similar discrimination. Captain Karma turned Cross into a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice. The story was no longer just about one incident, it had become a symbol of accountability and change. Captain Cross stood in the jet bridge like a man watching his own funeral, unable to process the speed with which his world had collapsed. 25 years of flying thousands of hours in the cockpit, a pension that would have supported his retirement, all gone in the space of a 30-minute confrontation with a passenger whose appearance had led him to make the worst decision of his professional life. "This isn't legal," Cross said to Sarah Williams, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone grasping for any lifeline that might save him. "You can't terminate a pilot without due process. There are procedures, regulations, union protections." Sarah looked up from her tablet where she had been documenting every aspect of the termination to ensure full legal compliance. "Captain Cross, you filed a false police report, which is a federal crime. You engaged in racial discrimination, which violates both company policy and federal law. You threatened the employment of subordinates who attempted to provide appropriate customer service. Any of these actions alone would justify immediate termination for cause. But I didn't know she was the CEO," Cross protested, as if ignorance of Regina's identity somehow mitigated his behavior. "That's precisely the point," Sarah replied. "You treated her badly because you thought she was powerless to stop you. If you had known she was the CEO, you would have been respectful and accommodating. That proves your actions were based on prejudice, not legitimate security concerns." Cross looked around desperately for support from his colleagues, but found none. First Officer David Kim was inside the aircraft, preparing to take command of the flight. Flight attendant Jake Williams was helping passengers board his career prospects suddenly much brighter than they had been an hour earlier. The ground crew was avoiding eye contact, unwilling to associate themselves with someone who had just become a liability. Meanwhile, Regina was conducting her own real-time assessment of how deeply the problems at Skybridge Airlines ran. Cross's behavior hadn't occurred in a vacuum. It had been enabled by a culture that prioritized authority over accountability, procedure over principle. Carla Regina said to her chief of staff, "I want a complete audit of all customer complaints filed in the past 3 years. Cross-reference them with employee personnel files to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior. And I want it done by tomorrow." "Already started," Carla replied, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with the corporate team back in headquarters. "We're also monitoring social media response and preparing for the media requests that are already flooding in." David Chen, the general counsel, was handling the federal reporting requirements that would formally document the incident for regulatory authorities. "Regina, we need to discuss the broader liability implications. If Cross's behavior represents a pattern that the company knew about but failed to address, we could be looking at civil rights violations that go beyond this single incident. Regina nodded grimly. David, assume the worst-case scenario and prepare accordingly. I'd rather be over-prepared for litigation than caught off guard by the scope of the problems we've inherited. The corporate machinery that had mobilized to respond to the crisis was impressive in its efficiency. But Regina knew that fixing the culture would take much more than emergency response protocols. She needed to understand how many other Captain Crosses were working for her airline, and how many passengers had been treated badly because previous management had prioritized operational convenience over basic human dignity. Tommy Rodriguez approached with his completed incident report, a document that would become crucial evidence in both the federal investigation and any civil litigation that might follow. Ms. Thorne, I've finished documenting the incident. Captain Cross made multiple statements that clearly indicate racial profiling, and his call to security was based on no evidence other than his objection to your appearance. This is as clear-cut a case of discrimination as I've seen in 8 years of security work. Regina thanked Tommy and accepted a copy of the report, knowing that it would be valuable documentation of exactly what had occurred and how airport security had handled the situation professionally and appropriately. As Flight 847 finally began boarding, now nearly 2 hours behind schedule, Regina watched the passengers move past First Officer Kim with none of the apprehension they might have felt with Cross in command. Kim greeted each passenger with professional courtesy, making no assumptions about who belonged where, based on anything other than their boarding passes. Elena Rodriguez had finally ended her live stream after nearly 3 hours, but not before conducting brief interviews with several passengers who expressed their support for Regina's actions and their hope that the incident would lead to meaningful change in the airline industry. What we just witnessed, Elena said in her closing commentary, wasn't just about one racist pilot getting fired. It was about a CEO who was willing to experience discrimination firsthand and then use her power to ensure it doesn't happen to other passengers. That's leadership. But the immediate fallout wasn't limited to praise and support. Within hours, Cross's union representative had arrived at the airport threatening legal action and claiming that the termination was hasty and excessive. Conservative media outlets were already framing the incident as political correctness gone too far, and questioning whether Regina's response was proportionate to Cross's actions. Regina knew that the real test of her leadership wouldn't be measured in social media reactions or news coverage, but in whether she could transform the underlying culture that had made Cross's behavior possible in the first place. Sarah Regina said as the last passengers boarded the aircraft, "I want mandatory bias training for every employee who has customer contact, and I want it implemented starting next week, not next quarter." Regina Sarah replied, "That's going to be expensive and disruptive. We're talking about thousands of employees across multiple time zones." Sarah Regina said, looking out at the aircraft that would carry her to London, "Do you know what's more expensive than bias training federal discrimination lawsuits? Do you know what's more disruptive than employee education? Viral videos of our staff treating customers like criminals because they don't look the part." As Regina finally boarded Flight 847 in Seat 2A, the seat she had paid for and always had a right to occupy, she reflected on the morning that had changed everything. She had bought this airline to fix it, but she hadn't expected to discover the problem so quickly or so personally. Captain Cross was escorted from the premises by corporate security, his career in aviation over his reputation destroyed, his pension forfeited. He had made a choice based on prejudice and assumption, and now he would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Regina Thorne settled into her first-class seat, finally able to experience the service she had paid for. But she wasn't thinking about the luxury accommodations or the premium amenities. She was thinking about the passengers who had been treated badly by employees like Cross, and about the changes she would implement to ensure it never happened again. The plane pushed back from the gate 47 minutes late, but Regina didn't mind the delay. Some lessons are worth the time it takes to learn them properly. As Flight 847 finally lifted off from Miami International Airport, Regina's phone buzzed with the preliminary results of the audit she had ordered. What Carla's team had uncovered in just 2 hours of database analysis confirmed Regina's worst fears about the scope of the cultural problems at Skybridge Airlines. Regina, Carla's voice came through clearly despite the aircraft noise you need to see these numbers immediately. Cross wasn't an outlier. He was part of a pattern. Regina put the call on speaker, not caring if other first-class passengers overheard. Transparency was going to be the foundation of the changes she was implementing, starting with her own communications. "Tell me," Regina said. "In the past 3 years, Skybridge has received over 400 complaints involving allegations of discrimination or bias. 92% of those complaints involved passengers of color. 68% involved gate agents or flight crews questioning whether passengers belonged in their ticketed class of service." Regina felt her jaw clench as the statistics painted a picture of institutional bias that went far beyond Captain Cross's individual prejudices. More concerning, Carla continued, is how those complaints were handled. 87% were classified as misunderstandings and closed without investigation. Only 13% resulted in any form of employee counseling or training. 0% resulted in disciplinary action. 0%. Regina repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. 0. The previous management team had essentially created a system where discrimination complaints disappeared into a filing system designed to protect the company from liability rather than protect passengers from bias. Regina looked around the cabin, noting the mix of passengers who had witnessed the morning's events. Several were still glancing at her with expressions ranging from admiration to curiosity. But now she was wondering how many of them had their own stories of being treated badly by airline employees who made assumptions based on appearance. "Carla, I want you to contact every passenger who filed a discrimination complaint in the past 3 years. I want to personally apologize to each of them, and I want to offer them compensation for their experiences. Regina. That could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements. Carla, do you know what hundreds of discrimination lawsuits would cost us? Do you know what the damage to our reputation would be worth? This isn't about the money. This is about doing what's right." As Regina ended the call, Jake Williams approached with the professional courtesy that had impressed her during the morning's confrontation. "Miss Thorne," Jake said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for supporting my actions this morning. And I wanted you to know that what happened with Captain Cross wasn't an isolated incident." Regina gestured for Jake to sit in the empty seat beside her, recognizing that she was about to hear firsthand testimony about the culture she had inherited. "Tell me," Regina said. Jake looked around to ensure their conversation would remain private, then leaned forward with the urgency of someone who had been waiting years to share what he had witnessed. "Captain Cross has been profiling passengers for as long as I've been flying with him. It's always passengers of color, always first-class or business-class passengers who don't fit his image of what premium travelers should look like. He calls it maintaining standards, but everyone knows what it really is." "How many other captains behave this way?" Regina asked. "It's not just captains. Gate agents, flight attendants, even customer service representatives. There's a whole culture of making assumptions about who belongs where based on how they look. And when passengers complain, management tells us to document the incident and move on." Regina felt a familiar anger building, not the hot fury of personal insult, but the cold determination of someone who had just identified a problem that needed to be eliminated completely. "Jake, I want you to document everything you've witnessed. Names, dates, specific incidents. I want a complete picture of how this behavior has been normalized and enabled. Ms. Thorne, if I report on my colleagues, it could make my work environment very difficult." Regina looked at Jake with the expression of someone making a promise that would be kept at any cost. "Jake, your work environment is about to change dramatically. and anyone who makes it difficult for employees to report discrimination is going to find themselves looking for new jobs. I'm not interested in managing a company culture that tolerates bias. I'm interested in building a company culture that eliminates it. As the flight continued toward London, Regina spent the remainder of the journey conducting informal interviews with passengers, crew members, and anyone else willing to share their experiences with airline service. What she heard confirmed that the problems at Skybridge were deep widespread and had been ignored for so long that they had become part of the normal operating culture. By the time the aircraft began its descent into Heathrow, Regina had filled 12 pages of notes with specific incidents, policy failures, and cultural problems that needed immediate attention. She also had a list of employees like Jake Williams, who had tried to do the right thing within a system that didn't support or reward ethical behavior. But most importantly, she had a clear understanding of what needed to be changed and how quickly it needed to happen. The pattern that had been exposed wasn't just about Captain Cross making poor decisions. It was about an entire organizational culture that had normalized discrimination, created a system for the suppression of complaints, and created an environment where bias was not just tolerated, but actively protected. Regina had bought Skybridge Airlines to turn it around financially. Now she understood that financial success would be impossible without first transforming the fundamental values and behaviors that shaped how the company treated its customers. The real work was about to begin. By the time Flight 847 touched down at London Heathrow, 7 hours after its delayed departure from Miami, Regina Thorne's phone contained 47 missed calls, 212 text messages, and enough voicemails to fill several hours. The story had gone global with news outlets from CNN to BBC to Al Jazeera, covering what media were calling the most public firing in corporate history. But Regina wasn't interested in media coverage. She was interested in results. Her first call from the Heathrow terminal was to David Chen, who had remained in Miami to handle the immediate legal and regulatory requirements that followed Cross's termination. David, what's the status on federal reporting? Filed with the FAA, filed with the Department of Transportation, filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, David replied. Cross's pilot's license is under investigation, and the DOT has opened a formal inquiry into company practices. We're also dealing with media requests from every major news outlet in North America. Good. What's the status on Cross himself? He retained a lawyer who's threatening wrongful termination lawsuits, but it's mostly posturing. The video evidence is overwhelming, and his own statements to security create multiple grounds for termination with cause. His union rep is making noise, but even they can't defend racial profiling. Regina nodded with satisfaction. Swift justice required thorough documentation, and David's team had provided exactly that. What about the broader investigation? Regina asked. That's where it gets interesting, David said. Once we started pulling complaint records and cross-referencing them with employee files, we found patterns that go beyond individual bad actors. This looks like a cultural problem that was created and maintained by management policies. Regina felt her resolve strengthen. Individual prejudice was bad enough, but institutional discrimination was unforgivable. David, I want termination proceedings started immediately for any supervisor who suppressed discrimination complaints. I want every employee who was disciplined for reporting bias to be reinstated with full back pay, and I want a new complaint system that reports directly to my office, not through the management chain that was covering this up. As Regina made her way through Heathrow Airport, she noticed something that would have been invisible to her before the morning's events. The way airline staff interacted with passengers varied dramatically based on appearance age and perceived status. The polite efficiency shown to business travelers disappeared when dealing with families with young children, elderly passengers who moved slowly, or people whose clothes suggested they weren't frequent flyers. It wasn't unique to Skybridge. It was an industry-wide problem that most people had learned to accept as normal. But Regina was no longer interested in accepting anything as normal that shouldn't be acceptable in the first place. Her second call was to Sarah Williams in Human Resources. Sarah, I want immediate suspension, pending investigation for every employee mentioned in Jake Williams's report. I want interviews conducted with every passenger who filed a discrimination complaint in the past 3 years. And I want a new employee handbook that makes it crystal clear that bias and discrimination are grounds for immediate termination. Regina, that's going to be a massive undertaking. We're talking about potentially hundreds of employees across dozens of locations. Sarah, we're talking about hundreds of passengers who were treated badly by our employees and thousands of potential customers who won't fly with us because they've heard stories about how we treat people. The undertaking is necessary. By the time Regina reached her London hotel, the termination of Captain Cross had been formalized and documented. His security clearances had been revoked. His access to company systems had been terminated. His personal effects had been collected from his crew locker. His 25-year career with Skybridge Airlines was officially over. But Regina knew that firing Cross was only the first step in a much larger transformation. Real change would require examining and restructuring every policy procedure and cultural norm that had made his behavior possible. Her third call was to the entire Skybridge Airlines Board of Directors gathered in emergency session to address the crisis that was dominating business news coverage. Ladies and gentlemen, Regina said, her voice carrying clearly through the conference call, today's incident has given us an opportunity to address cultural problems that have been damaging our brand and driving away customers for years. I'm proposing immediate implementation of comprehensive reforms. Board Chair Margaret Thompson spoke first. Regina, while we support your response to today's incident, we're concerned about the broader implications of such extensive changes implemented so quickly. Margaret, let me be very clear about the implications we should be concerned about. Regina replied, we have documented evidence of institutional discrimination that could result in federal civil rights violations, class action lawsuits, and Justice Department intervention. The choice isn't between change and stability, it's between controlled change and court-ordered change. The board discussion continued for 45 minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt. Regina's acquisition of the company had been based on her track record of successfully transforming organizational culture, and the board had hired her specifically to implement changes that previous management had been unable or unwilling to make. By unanimous vote, the board authorized Regina to implement whatever reforms were necessary to eliminate discrimination and bias from Skybridge operations. Her fourth call was to Jake Williams, who was beginning the return flight to Miami and still processing the day's extraordinary events. Jake, I want to offer you a promotion. Director of Customer Experience Standards, reporting directly to me. Your job will be to identify problems like what we saw today and fix them before they become national news. Jake's voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Ms. Thorne, I appreciate the opportunity, but I love flying. I don't want to lose that. Jake, you'll still fly, but now you'll fly as my personal representative, experiencing our service from the passenger perspective and ensuring that every customer receives the respect they deserve. Think of it as undercover customer advocacy. As Regina ended her calls and prepared for the business meetings that had brought her to London in the first place, she reflected on the speed with which justice had been delivered. In less than 12 hours, Captain Cross had gone from being a senior pilot with job security and retirement benefits to being an unemployed former aviator whose discriminatory behavior had been broadcast to millions of people worldwide. The consequences had been swift, thorough, and public. But Regina knew that real justice wouldn't be measured by how quickly Cross was punished, but by how effectively Skybridge Airlines changed its culture to prevent future discrimination. Cross's career was over, but the work of transformation was just beginning. and Regina was determined to ensure that no other passenger would experience what she had experienced and no other employee would feel pressured to enable discrimination in order to protect their job. Justice had been served. Now it was time to build something better in its place. Within 72 hours of the Miami incident, Regina Thorne had transformed Skybridge Airlines from a company that tolerated discrimination into one that actively fought it. The changes came with the speed and precision of someone who understood that cultural transformation required immediate visible action rather than gradual policy adjustments. The first reform was the establishment of the Customer Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to eliminate bias from every customer interaction. Regina personally funded the program with a $50 million commitment, making it clear that this wasn't a cost-cutting exercise disguised as social responsibility. This was a fundamental business priority. Every passenger who buys a ticket from us is making a choice to trust us with their travel needs, Regina announced in a company-wide video message. We're going to earn that trust by treating every customer with the dignity they deserve, regardless of their appearance background or any other factor that has nothing to do with their legitimate business with our airline. The second reform was the implementation of mandatory bias training for every employee who had customer contact. Unlike typical corporate training programs that focused on legal compliance and risk avoidance, Regina's program emphasized real-world scenarios and practical skills for providing excellent service to all passengers. Jake Williams, now Director of Customer Experience Standards, led the training development with the authenticity of someone who had witnessed discrimination firsthand and the credibility of someone who had chosen to act against it. This isn't about political correctness or sensitivity training, Jake explained to the first group of employees to go through the program. This is about customer service. When you make assumptions about passengers based on how they look, you provide worse service. When you provide worse service, customers choose other airlines. When customers choose other airlines, we lose money and jobs. The training included video testimonials from passengers who had been discriminated against role-playing exercises that helped employees recognize their own unconscious biases and clear guidelines for providing consistent professional service, regardless of customer characteristics. Most importantly, the training included protection for employees who reported discrimination or challenged inappropriate behavior by colleagues or supervisors. If you see bias, report it, Regina emphasized in every training session she attended. If you experience retaliation for reporting bias, escalate it directly to my office. And if you choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, you will be supported and protected. The third reform was the establishment of customer advocacy positions at every major airport staffed by employees whose job was to identify and address service problems before they escalated into incidents like the one with Captain Cross. These customer advocates had the authority to override gate agent decisions, reassign passengers to different flights, authorize compensation for poor service, and escalate serious problems directly to senior management. They wore distinctive uniforms that made them easily identifiable to passengers and carried tablets that gave them real-time access to customer histories and complaint records. Our customer advocates are not there to enforce rules, Regina explained to the management team. They're there to solve problems and ensure that every passenger has a positive experience with our airline. The fourth reform was a complete overhaul of the complaint handling process. Instead of complaints disappearing into a bureaucratic process designed to minimize liability, every discrimination complaint now triggered an immediate investigation led by personnel outside the normal management chain. Passengers who filed complaints received personal phone calls from senior executives within 24 hours. Employees who were subjects of complaints received immediate retraining and monitoring. Supervisors who dismissed legitimate complaints without investigation faced disciplinary action up to and including termination. We're not going to manage complaints anymore, Regina told the customer service team. We're going to prevent them by addressing the underlying problems that create them. The fifth reform was the implementation of customer feedback systems that made it easy for passengers to report both positive and negative experiences in real time. QR codes on boarding passes linked to simple feedback forms that asked specific questions about respect, professionalism, and service quality. More importantly, the feedback was reviewed daily by senior management and used to identify both problems that needed correction and employees who deserved recognition for exceptional service. Elena Rodriguez, the travel blogger whose live stream had brought the Miami incident to global attention, was hired as a customer experience consultant to help design feedback systems that would actually capture passenger experiences rather than generate meaningless positive ratings. Passengers know when they're being treated badly, Elena explained to the development team. The question is whether you're going to make it easy for them to tell you about it, or whether you're going to force them to go to social media to get your attention. The sixth reform was a fundamental change in how employee performance was evaluated and rewarded. Customer service scores became as important as operational metrics. Employees who received positive feedback from passengers about respectful treatment received recognition and career advancement opportunities. Employees who received complaints about bias or discrimination faced immediate consequences, regardless of their technical job performance. Excellence in customer service isn't optional, Regina announced at the first quarterly employee meeting after the reforms were implemented. It's not something we do when it's convenient or when it doesn't interfere with other priorities. It's the foundation of everything else we do. The results were measurable and immediate. Customer satisfaction scores increased by 40% in the first month. Employee satisfaction increased by 35% as workers felt supported in providing better service. Social media sentiment about Skybridge Airlines shifted from predominantly negative to overwhelmingly positive. More importantly, discrimination complaints dropped by 80%, not because passengers stopped reporting problems, but because the problems stopped occurring at the same rate. The transformation wasn't without resistance. Some employees complained that the new standards were too strict, that they were being asked to provide special treatment to certain passengers, or that the focus on bias prevention was creating a hostile work environment for staff. Regina's response was direct and uncompromising. If treating all passengers with equal dignity feels like special treatment, that tells you how badly we were treating some passengers before, she said at a tense employee meeting in Chicago. If preventing discrimination feels hostile, you might want to ask yourself why you're comfortable with bias in the first place. Several employees resigned rather than adapt to the new culture, and Regina made no effort to retain them. We're not trying to change people's personal beliefs, she explained to the management team. We're requiring professional behavior that treats all customers with respect. If someone can't meet that standard, they're not a good fit for our company. By the 6-month anniversary of the Miami incident, Skybridge Airlines had become a case study in rapid cultural transformation. Business schools requested interviews with Regina about her change management strategies. Other airlines began implementing similar programs. Industry publications wrote articles about the Skybridge model of customer service reform. But Regina measured success differently. The real test isn't whether other companies copy what we've done, she told Jake Williams as they reviewed the latest customer satisfaction data. The real test is whether passengers who look like me can board our planes without wondering if they'll be treated with respect. Based on the data they were reviewing, that test was being passed every day. 9 months after the incident at Miami International Airport. Regina Thorne sat in her office reviewing quarterly customer satisfaction reports when her assistant brought her a letter that had been forwarded from the corporate communications department. The envelope was handwritten, addressed simply to the CEO, who stood up and marked personal. Inside was a letter from Dr. Sarah Jackson, an oncologist from Atlanta who had been traveling to a medical conference when she witnessed the confrontation between Regina and Captain Cross. Ms. Thorne. The letter began. I was sitting in gate B7 that morning when I watched Captain Cross discriminate against you. What I didn't tell the reporters who interviewed me afterward was that I had experienced similar treatment on 3 previous flights with your airline. Each time I was questioned about my first-class ticket, asked for additional identification, and made to feel like I didn't belong. Regina read the letter carefully, understanding that Dr. Jackson represented hundreds of passengers who had been treated badly by Skybridge employees over the years. I stopped flying Skybridge because I was tired of being treated like a criminal every time I tried to board a plane, Dr. Jackson continued. But last month I gave your airline another chance because of the changes you've implemented. The difference was extraordinary. The gate agent was professional and courteous. The flight crew treated me with the same respect they showed every other passenger. For the first time in years, I felt like a valued customer rather than a potential threat. The letter concluded with a line that Regina would frame and hang in her office. Thank you for proving that change is possible when someone with power chooses to use it for justice rather than just profit. Regina had received hundreds of similar letters over the months since implementing the Customer Dignity Initiative. Each one reinforced her conviction that the changes had been necessary and that the impact extended far beyond Skybridge Airlines. But the letter that affected her most deeply had come from her own employees. Jake Williams had written to thank her for creating an environment where doing the right thing was supported rather than punished. Maria Santos, the gate agent from that morning in Miami, had written to describe how the training programs had helped her recognize her own unconscious biases and become a better customer service professional. Even First Officer David Kim had written to express his appreciation for leadership that valued integrity over hierarchy. The personal impact of the transformation wasn't limited to warm letters and positive feedback. Regina's own understanding of leadership had evolved through the process of changing Skybridge's culture. I used to think that good leadership meant having the right vision and the ability to execute it, Regina reflected during an interview with Harvard Business Review. But I learned that good leadership sometimes means being willing to experience problems personally, rather than just reading about them in reports. The interview had been one of dozens, as Regina became a sought-after speaker on corporate transformation, bias prevention, and ethical leadership. But she remained focused on the operational details of running an airline, rather than the celebrity aspects of her public profile. The most important metric isn't how many speaking invitations I receive, Regina told Jake during one of their weekly review meetings. It's how many passengers can fly with us without wondering if they'll be treated fairly. That metric had improved dramatically. Customer satisfaction scores had reached industry-leading levels. Employee retention had increased as workers felt proud of the company they represented. Revenue had grown as positive word of mouth attracted passengers who had previously chosen other airlines. Most importantly, discrimination complaints had become rare enough that each one received personal attention from Regina herself. The personal cost of the transformation had been significant as well. Regina had invested not just money, but enormous amounts of time and emotional energy into changing the culture of Skybridge Airlines. She had attended hundreds of training sessions, reviewed thousands of customer feedback forms, and personally responded to every discrimination complaint filed with the company. Some days I feel like I'm running an airline, Regina confided to her board chair, Margaret Thompson, during a quarterly review. Other days I feel like I'm running a social justice organization that happens to operate planes. Regina, Margaret replied. You're running a business that proves those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. The conversation had taken place at 35,000 feet as the board was flying to a conference on corporate responsibility. Regina made a point of taking commercial flights whenever possible, usually on Skybridge aircraft, to experience the service that customers received. On this particular flight, Regina noticed that the flight crew treated every passenger with professional courtesy, regardless of age, race, appearance, or class of service. The gate agents had been efficient and respectful. The customer service representatives had solved problems quickly and fairly. It was the kind of experience that should have been normal all along, but Regina understood that making it normal had required extraordinary effort and unwavering commitment to change. As the plane descended toward their destination, Regina reflected on the morning that had changed everything. She had bought Skybridge Airlines as a business investment and discovered that the most important changes couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings reports. The morning Captain Cross discriminated against me was the worst customer service experience I've ever had, Regina told Margaret as they prepared to disembark. It was also the most valuable because it showed me exactly what needed to be fixed. Margaret smiled. And now Regina looked around the cabin at passengers gathering their belongings, many of whom were Black, Hispanic, Asian, elderly, young, casually dressed, and would have been potential targets for discrimination under the old Skybridge culture. Now Regina said, "I see an airline where every passenger can fly with dignity. That's worth more than any acquisition I've ever made." As Regina and Margaret left the aircraft, they were approached by a young black woman in casual clothes who looked remarkably similar to how Regina had looked on that morning in Miami. "Excuse me," the young woman said nervously. "Are you Regina Thorne?" Regina nodded, wondering if she was about to hear another discrimination story or a complaint about service. "I just wanted to thank you," the young woman said. "I'm a graduate student and I fly to conferences about 4 times a year. I used to dread flying because I never knew if I'd be treated like I belonged or like I was trying to scam my way into accommodations I couldn't afford. This was the first flight where I felt completely comfortable from check-in to arrival." Regina shook the young woman's hand and realized that this was what real success looked like. Not headlines or speaking invitations or business awards, but passengers who could travel without fear of discrimination. "Thank you for giving us another chance," Regina replied, "and thank you for letting me know that the changes are working." As the young woman walked away, Regina understood that her work at Skybridge was far from over. Cultural transformation was an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. But she also understood that the foundation had been built, and that every passenger who flew without discrimination was proof that change was possible when someone with power chose to use it responsibly. The personal impact of that morning in Miami would last far longer than any quarterly earnings report. 2 years after the morning that changed everything, Regina Thorne stood in the same gate B7 at Miami International Airport, where Captain Richard Cross had tried to deny her boarding. But this time she wasn't dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. She was wearing a business suit and standing before an audience of airline executives, civil rights leaders, and media representatives for the announcement of the Skybridge Customer Dignity Initiative's national expansion. 2 years ago, I experienced discrimination that should never happen to any passenger," Regina said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded gate area. "Today, I'm announcing that what we've learned at Skybridge will be shared freely with any airline committed to eliminating bias from air travel." The industry transformation had exceeded even Regina's ambitious goals. Skybridge Airlines had become the most respected carrier in North America, with customer satisfaction scores that set new industry standards. More importantly, the changes had rippled throughout the aviation industry as other airlines implemented similar programs to avoid becoming the next viral discrimination story. Jake Williams, now Vice President of Customer Excellence, stood nearby with a satisfied smile as he watched Regina address the gathered crowd. His team had documented over 1,500 instances where the new policies had prevented discrimination before it occurred, and customer advocates had resolved thousands of service issues before they escalated into complaints. In the audience, Elena Rodriguez continued her travel blogging with a focus on airlines that prioritized dignity and respect for all passengers. Her review of Skybridge's transformation had been viewed over 5 million times and cited by other companies implementing similar changes. But the real measure of success, Regina continued, isn't in our customer satisfaction scores or our revenue growth. It's in the fact that every passenger can board our aircraft knowing they'll be treated with the respect they deserve regardless of how they look or where they come from. As Regina concluded her remarks, she looked around the gate area and saw something that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Airline employees from multiple carriers treating every passenger with professional courtesy, regardless of their appearance or background. The changes at Skybridge had created industry-wide pressure to eliminate discrimination, and the results were visible everywhere. After the media interviews and executive meetings that followed her announcement, Regina found herself alone in the same spot where Captain Cross had blocked her path and demanded that she prove she belonged in first class. She pulled out her phone and typed a simple message that she posted to her social media accounts. Respect isn't earned by the ticket you buy or the clothes you wear. It's a human right that should never require an upgrade. Today, millions of passengers can fly with dignity because one person chose to stand up when it mattered. The next time someone underestimates you based on how you look, remember they might be talking to their next boss. The post would be shared over 2 million times, but Regina was already thinking about the next challenge. Because real leadership isn't about solving problems, once it's about creating cultures where those problems can't happen again. And every passenger who flew safely, comfortably, and respectfully was proof that change is always possible when someone with power chooses to use it for justice. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, share this story. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments about a time when someone underestimated you and how you proved them wrong. Because sometimes the person you're dismissing is exactly the person who has the power to change everything. And remember, respect is never an upgrade, it's standard service. If this story inspired you to stand up for what's right, smash that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable when good people refuse to stay silent. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you step on because they might be the one holding the ladder. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice, karma, and the power of standing up for what's right.